how for it to take shape.
Right.
And we actually wrote an article for Theology Today that was kind of like a first shot at kind of, well, what pieces could we put together around this? And we instantly saw this. There's a book here, easily.
Yeah. Attention to whiteness is really, it's beginning to grow now in literature and scholarly stuff. But that was an important thing for us to look at because it goes with this notion of colorblindness. And colorblindness has been a way that white communities have typically said, I'm not racist. I don't see race. I'm colorblind. But what that has effectually done, and we certainly talked about this a lot, is lead to just the continual support, unintentional, of what are basically structural racist realities that just surround us, and yet we're not aware of. Because there's been a tendency among whites to reduce racism to an intentional malicious act. And most of us think we don't do that. So it was really important. And we both just really, as Marcia said, resonated with these interests.
The loss, the trivialization of human connection and human community when it is homogenous, when it is a monoculture, is actually clearly spelled out in Scripture at many different junctures. And I think one of the things we tried to do was surface the real, kind of invitation of Eucharist to be a place where there is this kind of diaspora coming together, people who've been wounded, people who've been marginalized, people who've been betrayed, people who have no idea how to taste redemption. And they come together in this place where we can be broken and we can be redeemed. So if we come to this table that has all this promise and we don't tell the truth about this huge wound that has really divided the church, our country, neighborhoods, schools, communities, relationships, families, then how are we really partaking in the feast? I mean, I think for me, it is an issue of thinning out, kind of sucking the life out of something that had so much more to give us. But instead, it's kind of become a reiteration of a lie that we tell ourselves. That it's okay that this is the way it is, and we can't help it that this is the way it is, and that there's nothing wrong with the way it is.
It's not that we're identifying the only form of brokenness that exists in the human community or the church. I mean, there are all-white churches, certainly where people do communion, where other wounds, other grievances can be thought through or experienced as being addressed by this communion, coming together. But we are highlighting one that is just rather stark and historically real and ongoing and unaddressed adequately, because we're invoking, not to romanticize it, but we're invoking the sort of some of the basic intentionality of the communion. It's to bring people together. I can't quote the Bible explicitly, but from all nations,
together
all
in
nations,
one place,
gather together. Well, it's not that, as I said, there aren't other wounds and forms of brokenness that people that look alike need to gather together, but we also need to address them and name them and identify them in order to begin to think about it as a gathering that is redemptive.
I think people are pretty clear on that that's a deficit in mainline churches, is their racial homogeneity. I think people pretty much get that these days, but they don't really have any kind of understanding of, well, what did we do? What is it about us that has created that problem, or has created this kind of diminishment of what we say we are? We say we're welcoming. We say we're inclusive. We say we're a place that all people can come and come as you are, and so I think for us, Eucharist so invokes that rhetoric that it was just a way to kind of create a template, a container for the conversation. But we could have chosen a lot of things, about the life of the church. The Eucharist just felt like a really rich kind of container for it.
Well, I wrote a book on an interracial church. I did an ethnography there, and I started about 14 years ago. I wanted to discern, what are the ways of thinking and the insights, and what has made this kind of church happen. And it was very disclosive for me, because I discovered my own prejudices. And I discovered what I ended up writing about as this sort of disconnect between what we say we believe and what our bodies think or feel, or the way who we're used to being with, to use an example. So I opened the book by describing how, when I went to this, what I perceived to be, heard was an interracial church, the first Sunday I went there, I walk in thinking, I'm this liberal, wonderful, non-racist person coming here to, write a wonderful book or something. I walk in the room, and that Sunday it just happened that most of the people there were black. And I realized I felt uncomfortable. I mean, I became acutely aware of my whiteness, and I felt uncomfortable, which was embarrassing. And I realized that, and then I went on to do some more research, that there are these phenomenon called habituations, bodily habituation, racialized bodily habituations, where whites are used to being in the majority. So we can feel perfectly comfortable with a couple of, or two or three, black faculty or whatever in any kind of group, or a few bodies of color in our church. But and the example I'll use to illustrate this is this church had decided to become multiracial when it started out as a very small, new white church. And eventually there was this event where an African preacher was brought. The first preacher was a white guy. An African preacher came, and more African friends of his came to the service. And one of the white families got really upset, and they said, the church is getting too black. Now that's just another example of what it means to do what one of my African American colleagues called ownership of space. Because I described this event to him, and I said, do you have a term for that? And he said, oh, sure, white ownership of space. When too many of us, come in the room, you all feel uncomfortable.
In my book, Let the Bones Dance, I talk about how the kind of calcification of bodies in mainline Protestantism, the intellectualization of worship, are part of the ways that white supremacy are held intact in our worship forms, in our kind of governance of the church, in the skill sets that are valued, and in the music that we use, and in all the different ways that we really incorporate people into a community. And I pastored a multi-ethnic, multiracial church in California, and I saw the dynamics of this at work in very interesting ways, in the way that people were able to kind of, and not able to, welcome new people who brought different habits of worship, different ways of responding in worship. For instance, we had some Pentecostal folks come to worship with us one day, and they brought their tambourines and they said amen, and it was actually pretty awesome. I was preaching and it felt great. People not look half dead out there, responding to the worship and really just taking up space in there with their whole selves. And after the service, one of our deacons came up to me and said, it's fine if they come, but they need to know how to act. That was disrespectful. And so her formation in the church was that to use your good manners in church was to be quiet, to be, still, to be moderated in your behavior, and certainly to not use your body like that. For her, it was about good manners. And to help people unpack that, you have to talk some about racialized biases and how these norms have come to be taken for granted as right versus an expression of a particular culture or an expression of a particular way of doing things. When for our Pentecostal brothers and sisters that came and worshiped with us that day, that was respectful. That's how they showed respect, is to say they're listening. I'm listening to you. I hear what you're saying. Preach, amen. And that was their ultimate way of showing respect. If they had been silent during the sermon, that would have been disrespectful from their formation. And so those are pretty obvious examples. The Eucharist only has integrity in context and in relationship. It is about the bodies around the table. It is not words in a book. It is not administration or whatever. It is about the hands, the feet, the eyes, the flesh, the bread, the cup, and how we are there together. So I think what Mary and I tried to do in that section of the book, where we're kind of inviting people to think about stretching out their mode of operation in the Eucharist, to think about some of these things, was to point toward a few markers of how we can begin to make space for this kind of truth-telling, this kind of integrity of presence, in which we are allowed to have the broken body, the betrayed body, be seen, be acknowledged, and hopefully be addressed and healed, or at least assisted in its healing in some way. So I think one of the things that was important to me in the work that I've done in white dominant churches is that those who approach the table do so with some skill, with some new learned skills around vulnerability and incompetency. And when I say incompetency, I mean shedding our kind of white armor that we have, that we must be competent, that we must know how to do it well and right and decently and in order. That's what we say in the Presbyterian Church. And that we must be ready to make some mistakes, to fumble around a bit with how to do this thing that we're not really very good at, and how to cede power and say, I'm not controlling this situation. I am a part of it, and I'm going to be present here, and I'm going to notice my discomfort, and I'm going to embrace that discomfort as a sacred moment in this healing process. So for me, it's really about kind of retooling, reskilling our bodies with the ability to be present and uncomfortable and incompetent and vulnerable and broken.
American is specific, and while I read about or hear on the news, problems of racism across the planet, those would be obviously contextual. They're problematic. I mean, it sort of gives me the impulse of wanting to say it's sort of a human propensity to secure with something, like my status as a white person, my status as an American or whatever. So that would happen with all human beings, but it seems like American is distinctive. I mean, any country would be distinctive, and one of the problems in what I've written and thought about has to do that I tend to think of race as a binary. It's white and black, and that's an inadequate way to think about it. I mean, you can only write about so much, but persons of color would be another way to sort of widen the category. But our histories clearly have to do with particular groups who were racialized in particular ways. So that's clearly an ongoing issue, because there's been such a let's move on, we've fixed this, get over it attitude tends to be prominent. And again, there's been more and more literature written on this, white colorblindness thing that, I mean, slavery, but I mean, hell, we don't do that anymore. And the desegregation laws fixed our problems in the 60s, so let's just move on.
Whiteness is a category that is an American creation. It was created in American colonial times, and it was about the concentration of wealth and the control of female bodies. I mean, there's been a lot of great literature around the idea of whiteness and its invention, and the particularly American expression that it found, and how that created the conditions for slavery to take hold in this country in such a profound way. There are all the layers that come with it: capitalism, kind of white supremacy, culture, patriarchy. There are all sorts of ways we can look at it. But I think because our country is still pretty young in terms of, the development of cultures, really some of the founding kind of building blocks of it were white supremacy and compelling other cultures to either assimilate or literally die. And so because that impulse to kind of create this conformity around white norms has really not dissipated, we didn't really deal with the cost of slavery because we didn't really value the kind of other cultures, the not just cultures, but the kind of existential quality of culture and how devastating it is for Native, First Nation peoples, for people of color who were brought here against their will, the devastating quality of ripping a person's culture from their lives, and then and doing that in a violent way. So we didn't deal with the cost of that, because part of white supremacy is not thinking that is valuable. The value is to assimilate into these white norms that are the better way to be. Well, we were done with our book before that happened. So we were certainly,
Yeah.
you know, we both felt really thankful for the Black Lives Matter movement and the conversation, and just, I mean, for us, it was just a real affirmation of the importance of what we were trying to do. But that's often the case with a book. You'll write it, and then something will happen, and people will be
really
like, "Oh, did you
relevant,
write this book because of that?" No, I was done with that 2 years before that even happened.
Yeah. I haven't had time to.
I think it's been affirming for me. I fully support the message. I fully support, I mean, also the student movements right now that we're seeing on campuses across the country.
Yeah.
I fully support the space for Black voices of people of color to be heard, and for their experiences to have, you know, for them to have the space to say, this is what it's like to be a person of color in this country or on this campus, and for white society to listen. And I think seeing how many white people and white institutions have reacted to that is really affirmation for what we've done.
Interesting. Yes.
The kind of, you know, defensiveness of
Right.
we're not racist here.
Right.
We believe in diversity. We have non-discrimination laws.
Right.
We believe in free speech, or you know, whatever.
Right.
This defensiveness around, like, actually dealing with.
It's all over. It was taken care of.
Right, and dealing with the real wounds of white culture.
Yeah.
So to me, the whole thing has really been an affirmation that we used our time well to write the book.
And I talk about this in the book a little bit. I'm in a Pauli Murray group at both that started at Duke, but also in the church that I did the ethnography of, that is about using the story of this African American woman who grew up in Durham and did some amazing things. She did law. She was a lawyer, did a lot of the desegregation research, although she never got credit for it. Then she's part of the civil rights movement. She ended up being the first African American female Episcopal priest. And we're using her story in our group, which is predominantly African American, to tell our own stories and to talk about when did we first become aware of race. We've been going now for 6 years. We meet once a month and share. This is a church group. And that, to me, has been a real display of what, at its best, Eucharist is about. It's about people coming together and sharing their wounds, yet being part of a faithful community. We're in relationship with each other, long-standing relationship. I don't want to trivialize it as if we're just instantly, I'm getting forgiven because I'm white and I'm telling the story of when I first became aware of race, which is a very different story than the women in the group and the man in the group who were African American. But at least to have the space where you can have these honest conversations. And of course, we inevitably talk about what's going on in the culture. So I hear, different experiences and interpretations of what's going on than I would if I was just in a reading group with all white people. Mm-hmm. So that's been and continues to be a very significant experience for me in terms of faith, a practice of faith. I'll call it that.